Academic skepticism. Now, this is not just skepticism in the academy, it is skepticism from the original academy, Plato's academy. The first of these skeptics was Arcesilaus, which I'm no doubt horribly mispronouncing. We'll call him Archi for short. He was born approximately 316 BC, died around 242 BC, and is likely to be still dead today. He took over Plato's academy, and he turned the academy, somewhat ironically, towards skepticism. His successor was Carneades, which I am probably also horribly mispronouncing, but he's also dead, so there's not a lot he can do about it. He was born in 214 and died in 129 BC. He took over the academy and was considered one of the most brilliant philosophers of his time. He served as the Athenian ambassador to Rome from 156 to 155 BC. Now, along with a Stoic philosopher and an Aristotelian philosopher, follower of Aristotle, he gave public speeches on philosophy. Back then, they didn't have YouTube and Twitter and Facebook, and so philosophers talking in public was one of the many forms of entertainment available at that time. Now, he employed and made famous the two-face method of skepticism. Now, Two-Face here is not the classic Batman villain with one side, disfigured and scarred, the other side normal, who flips a coin to decide people's fates. Rather, it's this. The Two-Face method is, on one day, he would go to the public square and give an excellent and brilliant argument in favor of a position, say justice. And the next day he would come back and give an equally good and excellent argument against his previous position, say against justice. And this is an extension of the method put forth by the Pyrrhonian skeptics, which is how to attack reason. Essentially, that is, you can give a brilliant argument for a position and a brilliant argument against it, thus supposedly establishing skepticism. So how did the academy, once controlled by Plato, the anti-skeptic, how did it become a den of skeptics? Well, here's how it happened, and how they try to justify it. The skeptics, when they took over the academy, thought that it had lost the Socratic spirit of inquiry and had settled down into dogmatism. This charge, of course, was ironic, given Plato's views that the forms were objects of knowledge and all his attacks on the sophists, who were skeptics. So how is this justified? How did the skeptics who took over the academy say, no, we're not going against Plato's academy, we're sticking with the true spirit? Which is something commonly done whenever people take over an institution and seem to be holding views not only different from the original views, but perhaps radically opposed to the original views. So the skeptics did is this. They focused on Socrates' classic claim that he knew nothing. They also point out that Plato's own dialogues tended to almost always, perhaps always, end without reaching a definite conclusion. They also employed Plato's Timaeus against him. Plato attacked the senses, and also in the Timaeus, he claimed that physics is merely a likely story. So the skeptics said, hey, look, we're just continuing the Platonic way. We're not really changing it. We're going back to our original roots, which also is something commonly claimed when people take over an institution and change it. They often claim that they're getting back to the original, the pure version. So the skeptics in the academy were attacking what they regarded as the dogmatism of the Stoics and Epicureans. Why? Well, the Stoics and Epicureans were empiricists, largely. They used the senses as a foundation of knowledge. So the criticism is stock criticism of the skeptic. While the senses, are there, they can only give appearances. Now, it might be argued back, as a standard argument back, that some sense impressions seem so indubitable that you had to accept them, that you can't possibly doubt them. So a person might say, here I am now doing this stuff. It seems so real. I can't possibly doubt this. And when an argument advanced, centuries later by our good dead friend John Locke was, pain. That if something hurts a whole bunch, it's really hard to doubt it. So here we see, perhaps not, the first appearance of the dream and hallucination argument, which basically goes like this. So if it's claimed that the senses can have experiences that are indubitable, that we cannot doubt, just think of dreams and hallucinations, where people experience things that seem utterly convincing and real, but are, of course, false. So we see the dream argument and hallucination argument beginning here, possibly. I mean, it might have occurred earlier, but the gist of it is that you can't trust your senses because this all could be just a dream or hallucination. Now, the skeptics also advance what's become yet another stock argument that's just recycled over and over and over again by the skeptics. And this is the criterion argument. So the argument is this: there can be no criterion for the truth. And this creates the usual infinite regress, which you may be familiar with from part 2, when we talked about infinite regresses, circular regresses, and reductio ad absurdums. So here's how the argument goes. Suppose a person says, aha, I have a standard of truth that tells me what is true. And the skeptic will, of course, say, but how do you know your standard of truth is true? You'll need justification for that. And so if I'm playing the skeptic's game, I'll have to come up with a standard to justify my standard, to establish its truth. So if I come back and say, aha, my original standard of truth is justified by this standard of truth. And then, of course, the skeptic will just look at me and say, yes, but how do we know that your standard of truth for assessing your original standard of truth is in fact good, that it's true? And if I go off and come up with another one, they'll just keep running the same thing. How do you know that standard is true? And this will go off into an infinite regress in which it can never be shown that the standard of truth is true. Now, the skeptics are careful not to fall into the obvious trap. So if you were to say to the skeptic, oh, Mr. Skeptic or Mrs. Skeptic or whatever they want to be called, but let's call him Skeptic. He said, if you say to them, so you know that we know nothing, and the skeptic would say back, oh, very clever, but I'm on to your game. I don't claim that we know nothing. I'm just claiming that we appear or seem to lack knowledge. I don't claim that we know that we don't know. So they actually were quite consistent. They suspended judgment as to whether skepticism was true or not, which is what they have to do if they're going to be consistent skeptics. They can't say that they know they don't know, otherwise they wouldn't be proper skeptics. So what they end up doing is not claiming that we definitely don't know. They are suspending judgment regarding their skepticism. Now, as you might imagine, their opponents, primarily the Stoics, criticized them and said, well, skeptics, if you're going to be consistent in your skepticism, that would mean you would have to suspend not just your judgment, but all activity. Because why do anything? Why, for example, eat lunch? You don't know if you need to eat lunch. You don't know if anything bad will happen. Why pay your rent? Why work? Why do anything? Because you don't know. And this can be kind of a biting point, because if the person says, hey, I can't know anything, and a reasonable reply is, well, then you're not going to do anything. Now, there are ways around this, but Carneades made a fatal mistake, namely compromise. He argued that while you can't be certain, you can get probability. And that's enough to allow human action. So, for example, if Carneades was around today and you said, hey, Carneades, would you go, shopping and the beach and stuff without wearing a mask? Carneades would say, well, no, of course not. Even though I can't know that I exist, I can't know that the virus exists, I can't know that I can catch it, I can't know anything, but it's probable that I do exist, it's probable that the virus exists, it's probable that I can catch it, so definitely if I'm going out, definitely wearing that mask. Now, might seem reasonable, but of course as a compromise, he got the scorn of the Stoics and later skeptics. In the case of the skeptics, the problem is if one accepts, probability, they're claiming to know, namely a probability. So it could be considered a form of skepticism. You could say, well, I can't be certain, but I can be probable. But of course, the clever and devoted skeptic would say, well, that's still claiming knowledge. Claiming a knowledge that there's a certain probability that this is true may not be the same as claiming that it's certain that it's true, but it's claiming that it's certain that this is probable. And so ended academic skepticism. Now, stepping into the skeptical, void or skeptical arena were the Pyrrhonians again. So next, we'll take a look at a revival of Pyrrhonian skepticism where it brings skepticism back again.